The Pastor and Postmaster podcast. What you wanted to hear in the sermon, but didn't get a chance to hear.
Where the Academy meets every day.
And this is going to be the episode where we actually come through on that promise, where the Academy will meet every day, because we are going to talk about a very important book that has a lot of pages. Augustine of Hippo's City of God. By the way, there's a debate. Should it be Augustine or Augustine? It doesn't really matter, by the way. Augustine's more the Latin pronunciation, but most of you maybe have heard Augustine. Of Hippo would be more the technical location where he's from. North African. So whenever someone talks about too many white theologians in church history, he is an African.
He's a dead non-white guy.
He's a Berber. He's a brown man. He was
Awesome.
a brown. He was from what would be modern day Algeria. So the City of God against the pagans, if you're wondering height, width, depth, it's a thick book. I read it over a period of 9 months. You know, it's always important to make sure that when you talk about a book, you've actually read it, especially if it's on a podcast.
Guilty.
How much of it have you read, my friend?
About a third.
I have read
Maybe
exactly
a little bit
nothing.
more.
You guys can't see me, but
No,
I'm here.
no judgment.
No judgment.
We can see you, but they can't. But your voice, it is a book that partly the reason we're doing this, there's going to be a series of podcasts we have, books you should at least know about, be familiar with. As I mentioned, a man in our church brought this up, read about it on World Magazine. So it's kind of a book that people know about. But in all honesty, it is massive. It's big. But if there's some themes in it that you probably already basically have adopted and don't even realize it. What are some of those?
Oh, definitely. I was just thinking about that. And as I was reading, I saw that Augustine talks about happiness a lot. And during that,
He does.
that time in the classical world, there were a lot of philosophers around, and their thinking, their ways of looking at life were therapeutic. They were looking for happiness for people. And so for me, in this day and age, what came to mind to me, and I wrote in the margin as I go, oh, John Piper. And that's somebody that most of us will know of, whether we embrace his views or not, or whether we like him or not. I think most people will identify him as a Christian hedonist. And so, he would say that, we find our comfort in God, we find our hope in God, we find our peace in God. We should also find our happiness and joy in God.
Yes. And by the way, if you don't ever read City of God or even read anything by Augustine, Google John Piper, Augustine biographical sermon. I don't think Google is going to be editing or shadow banning that, right?
No.
Hopefully not yet.
He's off their radar.
He's off the radar. It was a while back too, so he's past the point of danger. Great series, biographical sermons from City of God, about an hour and a half. So if you're listening to a podcast and you have time to do that, then you probably could listen to his sermon. It gives the story of his life. But let's just talk about him briefly. Brief biography. It's extensive. The book that he's most well known for that talks about his life is called Confessions. Mm-hmm. It is, at the beginning, he says a prayer to God. It's a story of his own conversion, and also it has a lot of other theological content that many of us are indebted to. We probably don't even realize it. He has a long struggle with living a sexually pure life. We'd say a chaste life. Has a woman he's not married to, a child. He has a mom who is a believer, prays for him, named Monica. And one of the most important things about the story is that he says how she prayed for him so long and he finally was converted. But he was a little older, 32 years old.
And he was a professional rhetorician, wasn't he? Or speaker?
Professional rhetorician, yes.
And so he was not some kind of weirdo. He had this profligate life that he lived, but he wasn't considered out of the ordinary or strange in those times, right?
No, he wasn't. And one of the stories, his dad wasn't a Christian. His dad's name was Patrick. But one thing interesting is that, like a lot of unbelievers, he wanted to have certain questions answered. And so he wanted to talk to a particular bishop that his mom, he told his mom and said, I have a bunch of questions for the bishop. Can you stump him? And
he was an eloquent speaker, right?
Eloquent speaker.
So there's that connection. I want to hear this.
I want to hear this. I want to hear it answers the problem of evil. I mean, basically the same questions we wrestle with today. So his mom takes him to see the bishop. I can't remember what his name was. It wasn't Ambrose. I think it was a different one besides Ambrose. They're a different priest. Maybe I'm correct me if I'm wrong, hearers, or I'll look that up and correct myself later. But I remember the pastor, the bishop, he will not engage Augustine and says, Monica, this is what you need to do. He doesn't need to talk to me. I'm going to pray for him. Now, that's not the only answer any pastor gave to him, but that pastor did. And it really startled him because he thought, I warrant a response from you.
Yes.
But he knew he wasn't looking for answers. And of course, in Confessions, he talks about the real reasons he didn't want to truly come to Christ yet, the lust of the flesh, and some other things. But anyway, he ended up being really important because essentially 1,000 years of church history is indebted to him. To get an idea of how influential he is, Martin Luther was an Augustinian monk.
Yes.
An order of monks, a sacred order, a holy order, set apart to study the works of Augustine, or at least that's the dimension they specialized in. So if you're a Protestant Christian, you probably don't realize that you're indebted to him.
Yeah, that was one of the questions I had for you that maybe we can talk about later. Does this book resonate with us because we follow in the steps of Luther, Calvin, Aquinas, and we're evangelical Protestants.
Yep.
So it all seems it's not when you read this book that's thousands of years old almost. It reads real easily to me. And I even found some phrases in there that are common phrases that we use. And I thought they were like 200 years old or 100 years old. And he's saying.
He said them. It's really fascinating. So basically the idea of the book here, you go, well, what's the book? I mean, this is not the only book he's written, by the way. And unlike many theologians, he actually have most of the stuff he wrote. He had a book of retractions. It's kind of like he lived long enough where he could be like, I'm going to go back and correct all my mistakes and say what they are.
And I think there's one Augustine scholar who said, anybody who tells you that they've read everything that Augustine wrote is a liar.
Is a liar.
Because think about that. In my lifetime, I barely have enough time to read what he wrote and thought about.
And he wasn't typing on a computer.
And how old did he live to be?
See, he was born in 354 AD and died in 430, 76 years old. By the way, I had to memorize for like a PhD. You have what's called the oral defense. You have to memorize all these dates of people's births. But for him, guys like him, they were memorizing everything. I mean, the rhetoricians, they had these long speeches. Until the late 19th century. I mean, if you were an intellectual, a learned person, you could recite poetry from memory at
That
balls.
sounds like my worst nightmare.
I think you could probably.
Yeah, and that's what they said about Richard Baxter. Is when you look at his manuscripts, they say that the margins are crowded with references to the early church fathers. So they call him Scribbling Dick because he wrote so much. He had, I think, over 140 works in his lifetime, and he's just putting this stuff out. He's producing all this stuff, and in the margins you can tell, he doesn't have them as reference. He's just right off.
It's really amazing. So in the book here, because there's so many themes, things like original sin. Obviously, he defends a traditional doctrine, or what is the traditional doctrine of hell is eternal punishment. But the big thing is that this is really a philosophy of history, but not quite, because it has a lot of other things in it. A theology of history, though we usually don't have a genre called that. But if you think about a single text that he's drawing from, it's Matthew chapter 13, 24 through 30, the parable of the weeds, where I think I mentioned this in the last podcast, where the field is sown with both like weeds, tares, that looks like wheat, Dardanelle, I think is what it's called, and then wheat. And so they grow up together, they look alike. The servants want to pull out the weeds, and the master says, no, if you do that, then you might pull up the wheat with the weeds. You got to wait till the end, till the harvest, then separate them, and then throw the weeds into the fire and the wheat into the barn. And so the basic idea is this, okay? So he's living at a time after Rome has become Christian, which would be about, 312, 313 AD? So think about this. The Roman Empire, up to the point, the greatest empire. I mean, some even today would say it's the greatest empire in the history of the world. It was inclusive in the sense that it was able to accommodate other cultures. It was architecturally advanced. I went to Jordan in 2008, and you still see the aqueducts standing in the mid-air in Jordan 2,000 years later. I mean, it's amazing.
Listen up, NID.
Did you call
Exactly.
it aqueducts?
Yes.
Is it aqueducts or aqueducts?
Aqueducts. Maybe we should get a poll with our hearers about that.
And for our readers, I mean, for our listeners, I just referenced NID, Nevada Irrigation District. Our entire area is just full of these aqueducts.
Okay, so NID people, are they aqueducts or aqueducts?
It's a rival with Pastor Mike's son, who worked for NID, and now is with PG&E, so you worked at that time too. This is a local shibboleth.
Yes.
So for those local will know what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's a great empire. I mean, it does a lot of bad things. Obviously, the book of Revelation is pretty centered in the near context on Rome's idolatry. The emperor was semi-divine, ambiguously divine. The big thing was at least acknowledge God is in him. If not, he is God. Different emperors claim that.
Not simply sent by God or appointed by God, but some sort of infusion of deity and
manifest.
yeah.
So Augustine here, but there's great things Rome did. The Roman military, the peace they brought. Obviously, Christianity was able to spread through this existing structure, and finally, it becomes Christian. I mean, I guess you could say something like this: what if the Communist Party of China became Christian? And some say it maybe will. It would no longer be the Communist Party of China, but you're like the country that has now the world's second largest population has become this. It was a suppressor, and now it's become Christian.
Well, to be honest, I used to kind of be hopeful about that because through their Belt and Road Initiative and trying to establish trade with all kinds of countries. So like I have friends in Uganda, they come in, they put a lot of money in. Well, they send people in to build their infrastructure, and many of those people are Christians. And so in my mind, I thought, oh, is this how God is going to evangelize the world? Through the Belt and Road Initiative.
And many Chinese Christians I know pray for that.
Yes.
But just imagine that it does become Christian, gives legal favor to Christians, and then less than 100 years later, it's beginning to crumble. And barbarians, namely people who don't speak Greek, who don't speak Latin, okay, just people who are not cultured, are coming in.
Uncultured swines.
Uncultured swine. Those who have not read City of God. They're coming in. They're coming across the Andes, or not the Andes, the Himalayas. They're coming from Mongolia. Whatever. The country is crumbling, and some people that still can remember to the old days say, remember when we worshipped the old gods?
Right.
Those were the days when Rome was great. And they say, let's make Rome great again. And they say it means go back to paganism. Well, obviously, Augustine is quite aware. As a Christian, he's thinking, well, surely I can't say that it becoming Christian is a bad thing. But at the same time, we got to really rethink what greatness is. We have to really rethink what the city of God is. And so he does something that no one before him has done, and really all of us are indebted to it to some extent. He does what intellectual people do. He makes new definitions up and subtleties. And he says there are, within any given culture in the world, there are two cities. There's the city of God and the city of man. By the way, city of God against the pagans, because he has people in mind who are saying Rome was great when it was not Christian. It was better when it was not Christian.
Right. The Christian God let us down.
Let us down. And Augustine's basically saying, he asked this question, what made Rome great? And he never denies that it's great in some respects. But what are some things that made it great that a Christian would take issue with? Maybe you're thinking that. What are some things? Maybe you guys could add some stuff or reflect on that. One of the things that he talks about is pride. Pride, sound familiar, is what made Rome great. Pride can get you to do great things. So the good examples he gives are their military.
Right.
The idea that you can...
Well, I'm trying to think of how to articulate this, but but to imbue the citizens with a sense of living a life that what's the term I'm looking? There's honor. We're gonna have to edit this out.
Yeah,
I know what you
totally.
mean.
That's okay.
The citizen is. You think about your reputation after death.
Yeah.
Were you
Legacy.
Yeah, the legacy of a Roman citizen.
Yeah, it's true. It's true even our military today. You have basically David French wrote an article a while back about the American military, and he pointed out how when your military has a reputation, a heritage, past victories, something that you are proud to honor, that keeps you in places where you're willing to die to defend the honor of that, because you're
In the outpost.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so countries that have new militaries or often will cave. It's not about strength or equipment. It's about not having the cohesion. And he said there are things that people did. He said they lived in order to have immortality by their names being spoken on people's lips.
Yes.
And basically all of us
legacy.
do that to some extent. Or at least we forget that doesn't matter ultimately. And he says, so those things motivated Rome. He has a lot of other things, fear of demons. He shows a lot of inconsistencies. But essentially he points out that there really is a city of God that is in and through, in some ways, interwoven with the city of man. And Christians find themselves interwoven with the city of man, including the Roman Empire and Christian Empire.
So would his view then come in conflict with Christians who want to completely withdraw from society or completely withdraw from the culture?
Yes, he would certainly oppose that, and those that have gone in his footsteps, and that includes Baptists, most evangelicals, have recognized that you are a part of the city and you're interwoven. And he says, honestly, you don't necessarily even know within the churches, with a full extent, who truly is destined for the city of God and who's a part of the city of man.
Right.
And so, yes, there's no way for you to be responsible and withdraw completely from politics. He advocated, I mean, he did not deny the imperial prerogatives of making an officially Christian empire. You'd call him a Christian nationalist, I guess, today of some kind, which would just be basically what everybody was. But at the same time, he would have offended people who wanted a theocracy. There have been fanatical groups that have essentially said we'll become so there was never saying that this emperor is appointed by God in the same way Saul was or David was. He has ambiguity. Well, I have a great quote here because, well, that's probably what you would like to know. He says something about providence and human governments. This is from book 4. There's 22 books, by the way. God, therefore, the author and giver of happiness, because he is the only true God, himself gives earthly kingdoms to both good men and to bad. He does not do this rashly or as it were at random, for he is God, not fortune. Rather, he acts in accordance with an order of things and times which is hidden from us, but entirely known to him. And he does not serve this order as though subject to it. He himself rules it as its Lord and disposes it as its master. As for felicity, so happiness,
There we go.
however, he gives it only to the good. There may be some servants who have it and others who do not. There may be some kings who have it and others who do not. But it will be complete only in that life where no one will be a servant. And so earthly kingdoms are given by him to good and evil men alike, so that those who worship him, who are still no more advanced in mind than little children, do not value these gifts from him as though they were something great. Thoughts on that?
Well, so there you have it, talking about the happiness piece or the felicity piece, because he's born into a world of philosophers. By the time he comes on the scene, what's his background in Manichaeism?
Yeah, he has a background. I mean, basically they would have what you call Neoplatonism.
Stoicism?
Yep, Stoicism.
Epicureans?
Yep, you have what are called the Manichaeans. He has a number of books against the Manichaeans. He has a commentary on Genesis against the Manichaeans. And the Manichaeans were a group, the name comes from a man named Mani. Big surprise. Mani from
East
Iran.
LA. Manny from East LA.
Manny from East LA. That's right.
No, I'm sorry. That's a hat tip to our heritage.
We'd have a great image that could pop up when you think Manny from LA.
This is Mani.
Manee.
Oh.
Or no, Mani. You're right.
Yeah,
You're right. But when it's spelled in English Manichaean, it has the two E's, which really, well, it's
Yeah.
confusing.
Yeah. And
But
did he live like in the 3rd century or
I believe he lived in the 4th century and part of the 3rd.
in Persia?
But basically, there's an age-old question: where does evil come from? And so, what does Manny say? He says it is a eternal principle that always is there. Mm-hmm. It's dualism. There is an evil principle, and that is the cause of all things that are bad. I've solved the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Some of like our, I guess you would say like race consciousness stuff is somewhat Manichaean.
Right.
There are ultimate evil principles that are there. And so Manichaeanism, it pops up a few versions. There's a group called the Albigenses in the 12th century, also called the Cathars, that have it. One of the interesting things about Manichaeanism is it did things like denied what we would call the goodness of creation. Sex is evil. Mm-hmm. Procreation is evil, particularly procreation. Do not bring children in the world who are essentially going to be subject to evil. Vegetarianism was a big part of it. And there was, of course, denial of all the Orthodox teachings on Christ. And
then it's going to die out like in the 1300s, right?
Yeah.
So there's no Manichaeans.
No. There's formal Manichaeans.
Yeah, but there's people with those sorts of views that...
The one group that probably got closest to it were the Shakers in the 18th century.
Interesting. Okay.
The Shakers were a Manichaean modern iteration.
So when you're reading The City of God,
out.
do you see any of those ideas in there because he writes against them later, or does he completely eradicate that from his... do you understand what I'm saying? Like,
the one thing I would say, and I'm somewhat Platonic in my sympathies. We could describe what that is another time, but
we want to talk about that because he definitely goes easier on the Platonists than
I'll give you an example. I'll tell you the one chief example that where some ideas of Platonic and Manichaean thought, and it's his view about sexuality. And I don't mean like gender stuff. I mean he has a somewhat odd view of sexuality. So his idea is in Platonism, the rational, the ideal world, the rational life is the one that's most virtuous.
And that's going to bring you the most happiness.
Bring the happiness. And most Christians have agreed with that. But what's weird about it is he says things like that whenever Adam and Eve were in the garden before the fall, whenever they had conjugal union, they had sex, there was no emotional involvement in it. It was completely rational, purely for procreation, which is odd.
I reject that on biblical grounds.
And no one really finally calls it out till Aquinas, where he actually says one of the purposes of sex is pleasure. Before that, nobody actually officially says that. So isn't that interesting? So he has a view. He has a jaded view of that. He does say too that the sexual act is sinful. Concupiscence is that English translated word?
Sure.
So there's some part of it that because it's driven by a passion in every person.
Okay.
There's something about that's not perfect. That's a part that most would rightly see as a blind spot. Mm-hmm. And obviously there's an element of it where you wonder, where does monasticism come from? Where does the celibacy? All those seeds are there in the writings, that the person who can live the best Christian life is one that is not driven by those sexual passions. And part of his own experiences, he talks a lot about them in the Confessions, were very bad. And so that gave him a little bit of a view that's clouded, we would say. Mm-hmm. But it does prepare the way for the Roman Catholic Church officially making celibacy mandatory for priests. Ideas have consequences.
Yes.
For good or for bad.
And that's why we go to Sola Scriptura.
And it also reminds you, nobody reads the Bible without a lens of their own experiences. We're just able to see other people's. I don't. Wow. You maybe do.
Well, no, I do. So I was counting on you not to.
Yeah. No, I know it is fascinating to think about that. Yeah. But anyway, so I know there's so much more to cover. I'm sure we'll have another one to cover this too, but we'll try to make a few themes to go on. I think especially for our own day and age, with just our heightened political.
Well, that's the reason I picked it up.
Oh, yeah.
Because of what's going on now, and I just thought, you know what, I need to get right with this in my mind, and look at how a Christian lives in an empire in decline, which is
What we are.
yeah, that's what I would say. But go ahead.
You know, it's interesting. So one more quote here I want to give. Probably might be the most memorable quote. He says, "Earthly kingdoms devoid of justice." Now he doesn't say all earthly kingdoms.
Mm-hmm.
He says, "Earthly kingdoms devoid of justice are but a great band of robbers."
Yep.
And what are bands of robbers but little kingdoms? That's a little ditty. Then he says, continues this: "The band itself is made up of men. It is governed by authority of a ruler. It is bound together by a pact of association, and the loot is divided according to an agreed law. If by the constant addition of desperate men this scourge grows to such a size that it acquires territory, establishes a seat of government, occupies cities, and subjugates peoples, it assumes the name of a kingdom more openly. For the name is now manifestly conferred upon it by the removal of greed, not by the removal of greed, but by the addition of impunity." One thing I would take away from this, and maybe if you never read this book, all you do is this podcast,
Mm-hmm.
you just remember these quotes. And if you look, thankfully YouTube transcribes it so you can see the quotes as long as I've said them correctly. That if you are looking for a perfect government, I mean, it seems that what Augustine has the closest that any Christian kingdom has had. I mean, some level, at least the earliest one. But even he recognized this, that even the way it's established
Right.
and maintained is corruption. And his response was not to repudiate it, as other Christians did, but to recognize the city of God working through it.
Mm-hmm. In the midst of that, or
Yeah. It basically keeps you from either like a revolutionary violence, which always ends very badly, or in complete like Anabaptist renunciation, withdrawal, where you basically rely on someone else's view like this for a country to live in. So we wanted to make this podcast more succinct, but we hope that you will pick up that book, or you will ask us questions, perhaps in the comment section, and perhaps we'll cover Augustine again. I think we will.
if the Lord wills.
If the Lord wills, in his providence. God bless you and have a great rest of your week.
Bye-bye.